I can remember as a child reading or looking at the comic strips on the kitchen floor. One of those was Buck Rogers. And Buck Rogers was, of course, this man of the future who was riding a spaceship into tomorrow. And so surely at a very young age, science fiction reduced to comics probably had some formative influence. But there were other things as well. I can remember getting very serious at a very young age, 8, 10 years old, reading the reports from Barcelona, or the Ebro, of the Spanish Civil War, and following that, and knowing somehow that the outcome of that meant something for the world and even for me. And I was formed again, further formed, of course, as everybody in my generation was, by World War II. All of that gave me I think, a special interest in politics and in the relationship of science and technology to that. Another very interesting formative influence were the movies. I grew up in an era before Hollywood had discovered the anti-hero, and they were indeed heroes. And I can remember seeing movies which made heroes of great scientists. Louis Pasteur, Edison, and so on. So science and the future very early on came to mean something to me, although I have never been a scientist, I have never been a technologist, I am not very good at mathematics and not very good at chemistry and those things, but I did have the wit at university to study the history of technology rather than to the technology itself. And of course the work that I've done ever since, jointly with my wife once I met her, has been focused on the impact of society on technology, technology on society, and trying always to relate all of this to every aspect of life, family life, work, religion, rather than taking the point of view of a very narrow specialist.
Alvin Toffler sorprende al mundo cada vez que publica un nuevo libro. Ahora se encuentra en Londres promoviendo su último libro titulado War and Anti-War, Guerra y Antiguerra. Toffler viene desde hace años advirtiendo al mundo los cambios que pueden suceder en las sociedades con mayor avance tecnológico y económico.
Alvin Toffler, I think we all have a curiosity about your new book. What made you and Heidi, your wife, write a book about war?
There's a story there. We had written La Tercera Ola, which was published in 1980. And in that book, we talked about the coming of a new civilization with a new economy, a new technology, and described what we thought was going to be happening. We got a telephone call from a general in Washington who said, the generals have been instructed to read your book. And we said, why? Because there's nothing about the military in this book. And he said, come to Washington and let's have dinner. So we did, in fact, go. And a man met us at a little hotel near the Pentagon, wearing civilian clothes, short, slender, intense man. And he said, what happens to society outside happens inside the military as well. And you've described a whole series of changes that are transforming our society, and we are transforming our military in parallel with that. And he then proceeded to explain to us over the dinner table that the American military, after the demoralization of Vietnam and the defeat and the terrible condition of the American military, which was corrupt and bloated and fat and bureaucratic and had no morale and so on, they had decided that they had to completely revolutionize the American military, and that they were now writing what he called a new doctrine of how to fight. He then took us up to his hotel room, and he gave us a presentation with slides on the wall that he had previously given that morning to Bush, who was then vice president. And in it he described a new way of confronting the Russians in Europe. What had happened was that during Vietnam, the Russians had built up their forces. They had more tanks and more troops and bigger forces available to them. And the issue was, could NATO and the United States block a Soviet move into Western Europe without using nukes? Using them if necessary. They never said they wouldn't. But was there a way of fighting that would make that totally unnecessary? And they came to the conclusion that there was, and that they had now written a new manual, essentially, about how to fight, which would, they thought, be able to defeat masses and masses of troops, even if they were outnumbered, without recourse to using nuclear weapons. And this was something called Air-Land Battle, and also Air-Land Battle 2000. Well, and as we left, that after a long, fascinating evening, he was an extremely intelligent man, very, later we learned he was called by the military our Renaissance Italian. He knew music, he knew art, he was a very interesting intellectual. As we walked out the door, he then said something to us. He said two things. One was a kind of theoretical idea. He said, in your books, you have written about the demassification of mass society, the increasing diversity and differentiation of society, of production, particularly in the factories. The advanced factories don't just put out 1 million identical products. They turn out 16 of this and 13 of that, and they do everything with great precision. He said, but the same thing is happening in the military. We are going from the demassification of production to the demassification of destruction. And what he made clear to us that night was that there's a relationship between the way a society makes its wealth, the way it works, the degree to which it relies on uniformity, standardization, mass production, and the way it fights. And the age of mass production was what gave rise to the age of mass destruction. And he said, we're now turning that corner, and we're moving away from the idea of mass destruction toward the same kind of precision that you have in the factory, the customization of destruction in parallel with the customization of production. As we walked out of the room, he stopped at the door and looked at us and said, I'm 49 years old and I'm dying. I have cancer, and it will be the fulfillment of my life if this new form of doctrine, this new approach to war, is adopted by the American military and by the Allies in general. And it has been. And we saw him a few times after that, and just before he died, he invited us down to meet his successor and some of the men he worked with, and then got into a black car driven by a sergeant and said, I would have valued our friendship if we only had more time. And we said we felt exactly the same way about him. He was a most unusual person. And he drove off, and we never saw him again. And we never thought about this again, or doing a book about war, until we saw Baghdad attacked during the Gulf War. And then what we saw was what we had seen in his hotel room 10 years or 11 years earlier. The same approach was now a reality.
Are other countries changing military as well as the United States are?
Yes, I think this is happening all over. Even poor countries now want smart weapons. All of this, see, the basic change is that as advanced economies, as economies advance, they become more and more dependent upon conocimiento, on knowledge. And that knowledge is embedded not just in computers and telecommunications, but at higher levels of science and technology and a deeper understanding of nature. And they are also more sophisticated, appropriate forms of organization. Well, everything that is happening in the most advanced sectors of the economy are also happening in the most advanced sectors of the world's military. And the smart weapons that we saw used in the Gulf, whether you liked the war or you didn't like the war, something had changed in the nature of war. And even though we now know that some of the technological high-tech weapons did not necessarily perform perfectly and so forth, the direction of change is now perfectly clear. Armies all over the world are trying to lay their hands on what they call smart weapons. And smart weapons do not destroy an entire village to get one building. They are selective. And they're just like medicine, like pharmaceutical, the latest pharmaceuticals, monoclonal antibodies. These medicines do not affect the entire body. They zero in on a particular cell or a particular receptor on a cell, just like the cruise missile zeroes in on a particular target. So there is a parallel. Something is happening out there, both to the way, as he said, the way we produce and the way we destroy. And this gave us, I think, a deep insight into the directions of change in the global system. And War and Anti-War, our new book, is not just about the military, but also about the emergence of a completely new global system in which, of course, military power plays a considerable role, as it always has.
You've heard about the Chiapas problem in Mexico, and what you just have said makes me think about the Zapatista army or the Ejército Zapatista, who took a city with wooden guns.
Well, what that means, I mean, several things. First, when a new form of warfare emerges, the old ones do not go away. Just when the machine age gave us the machine gun, and mass production, as I said, gave us mass destruction, and the mass society of industrial society gave us mass conscription. Everything became massified, but there were still places in the world where battles were fought in a earlier fashion. And we in this book, we talk about la guerra de primera ola, la segunda ola, y la tercera ola. 3 forms of war, and all of them will happen on the world at the same time. So you do not eliminate face-to-face combat when you develop mechanized warfare, and you do not eliminate mechanized warfare when you move toward knowledge warfare. And the crux of the matter is that in the future, the most important weapon will not be the gun. It will be the computer and the brain. There was a wonderful scene in a movie called Cuba, I think it was called Cuba, with Sean Connery. And he is a British agent who is sent to Cuba, and he is supposed to put down Castro's rising. And somebody asks him, "What's your favorite weapon?" And he says, "My brain." Well, that is a very insightful line, because the war in the Gulf was not won by air superiority. It was not won by massed troops. They were necessary. It was won by information superiority. The Americans and the Allies knew everything that Saddam Hussein was going to do before he did it. They took out the nervous system, the communications system that ran from his headquarters to his troops. Their primary target was to eliminate communication, what they call command and control, and to work on the knowledge system, not just the weapons.
It won't be necessary to kill in future wars.
That's a very interesting issue, because in War and Anti-War, in guerra y antiguerra. There is a whole discussion of the development of new kinds of weapons that are specifically designed not to kill people. They're called non-lethal. And there are conferences and meetings and discussions going on and research going on in laboratories, not just in the United States, but around the world, particularly in Russia, that aim at the development of weapons that could do two kinds of things. They can either deny an opponent the use of his equipment. For example, if an enemy has an airfield and you don't want him to use that airfield, the old way was you bombed it and you put a hole in the ground and the airplanes couldn't take off. In the future, we will probably not do that. We'll spray them with something that makes them too slippery to use. In the future, we may have the capability, in fact, we have it in a rudimentary form already, the capability of going into a crowd that has a hostage and disabling that crowd temporarily through using low-frequency electromagnetic waves. It'll make the crowd may vomit, or it may feel ill or sick or dizzy. Come in, rescue the hostages, leave. Nobody gets killed. So there is a lot of work going on, and even theoretical work, about the development of a whole new range of technologies that are called non-lethal. And after the Waco disaster in the United States, remember the shootout between our police forces and the religious fanatics. In Waco, the Attorney General of the United States, like your Minister of Justice, wrote to the Secretary of Defense and said we should jointly accelerate the work on non-lethal weapons. Had Yeltsin had non-lethal weapons, he would not have had to shoot tank rounds into the White House in Moscow.
So wars are becoming nice wars.
War is always bloody and nasty, and children get destroyed, and lives are. But there is something to this non-lethality, and it's a very interesting story that we tell there too. The two people who are most active in crusading for non-lethal weapons are a husband and wife team. He was a rock musician. She wears her hair down to here, highly intelligent, and they have been fighting for non-lethality. And the reason for that is they believe that non-lethal weapons can open a space between, or a time, between when the diplomats stop talking and the guns start shooting, that you can use non-lethal weapons to gain time for further negotiation and further attempts at peacemaking. And so they're extremely active in proposing this, and indeed just recently there were war games played in Washington using the theory of non-lethality. How can you win without killing? There is a research going on even as we speak. A French research institute has been commissioned by NATO to devise non-lethal methods to guarantee the no-fly zones in the Balkans, over Bosnia. How do you prevent other people's planes from entering that territory without shooting them down? And there are ways you can do that. You can destroy their radio equipment. You can change their compass. You can. There are a variety of things that are being discussed. But whether these things are going to, nothing is going to make war good, but they're going to change the character of war radically, and probably over a decade or two. Nor is this just something that rich countries are going to do. It is now, it will be possible, for good or for ill, within 5 years or 10 years, for very poor countries with very primitive missiles like the Scud that Saddam used, for $5,000 to put a smart unit on that makes that into a smart weapon that you can target precisely, and so on.
Are human rights going to be seen from a different point of view?
Well, I think you raise a very good question. We mentioned in War and Anti-War that if you move toward the development of non-lethal weapons, that has political consequences. That has civil liberties consequences as well, because you can be sure police will have them, not just soldiers. And the question is, we need to have rules in each society to control these. And one of the things we're trying to get in the United States is to get this out of secrecy and on into public discussion. And we're actually trying to get Congress to hold hearings about non-lethal weapons so that we can begin to set some democratic rules for their use in society and on the civil side. If they had been available to the Mexican military, my hunch is that fewer people would have died in Chiapas. Now, I have never been to Chiapas, but in La Tercera Ola, my wife and I wrote a passage which, except for the word Chiapas, described Chiapas. And what we said then we actually said it in Mexico City in 1975, but then we said in 1980 in La Tercera Ola, that unless Mexico, which in 1975 had a lot of oil revenue coming in and now has outside investment coming in, unless it learns to make that money reach the people at the bottom, there will be violence. There will be political repercussions. And I think Chiapas is just the beginning, and not just for Mexico. I think that the theory, I am frequently associated or regarded as a proponent of the market economy and capitalism. I think it works economically better than the alternatives have worked. But I do not believe that wealth automatically trickles down, as we say in the United States, that if you make people rich over here, the money will come down to the poor over here automatically. It doesn't happen automatically. And even if you want to, even if you're in the elite, and even if the whole elite agrees, we've got to bring the bottom up, economically, that's not a very easy thing to do. One has to know how to do that. It's also a question of how. And so far, nobody has been very good at doing this. So I think that Chiapas is an answer to the theory that we heard so much about a few years ago called the end of history, the ultimate triumph of economic liberalism and the marketplace. I think that there are going to be, in fact, I see Chiapas on a world scale. I see the re-election of communists in Poland and in Eastern Europe as part of the same process. We know what doesn't work. We know that the centralized state, we know that totalitarianism and the centralized state do not produce wealth for the people. That, in fact, by suppressing information and suppressing knowledge, they suppress economic development. But we don't necessarily know how to educate, how to bring everybody in the society into the benefits of the new technology and the new society. And
what about democracy?
Well, there are different forms of democracy. I think the United States is making a big mistake in going around the world and trying to market a particular form of democracy, which it doesn't work all that perfectly well in our own country. It's like selling used cars to Latin America. We go to Russia and we say, here's what you have to do, and here's the model. I think that there are alternative models, and that the model of democracy that we in the United States have, which I think is wonderful, is absolutely rusty, creaking, and breaking. And that because it was based on certain economic conditions and certain cultural conditions that are radically changed now. And therefore, we are going to face, I believe, I've been saying for many years, my wife and I, Heidi Toffler and I have been saying that the United States is going to face a constitutional crisis at some point. That the paralysis in Washington, the bureaucracy in Washington, the inability or the attempt by politicians in Washington to make decisions about so many different things that they know so little about, is going to bring the system down. And there will have to be some transfer of power downward from the center, a more decentralist, if you will, or the British use the term devolution, a devolution of power, and there will have to be changes in the actual structures. If I look at my Congress, and the same is true for the British Parliament and the Japanese Diet and all these others, there are very intelligent people in them making very stupid decisions. And it isn't the native intelligence of the individuals, it's the obsolescence of the decision-making apparatus. And all of our countries are going to have to invent new political structures. And we can't find them in a book. We're not going to find, and there's no model, there's no previous model that we can rely on. And this is the really risky crisis that the world faces.
For countries in development, democracy and economy have to go together.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, so to speak. If you ask the Chinese, they would say no. If you ask Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, he would say no. If you ask Americans, they would say yes. I think that that Castro points to Gorbachev and says he made a mistake by introducing glasnost before introducing economic reform. But it is not clear. And I think the answer to that, I don't have a single answer to that. I think it depends on the society, on the culture, on the people. The reason that it works the way it's working in China is because they're Chinese. And they have thousands of years of a culture, and they believe deeply, whether they say so or not, in Confucian virtues. And these are work hard, loyalty, loyalty to authority, and so forth and so on. But you begin to see, even in Singapore, where Lee Kuan Yew has done a brilliant job, but still retained an authoritarian,
He's not there anymore.
Yes, he's still there. He'll be there for a long time. Even after he's gone, he will be there. But even there, you now have a middle class, and the middle class is feeling constrained. The middle class wants more freedom.
Apparently, there is no crime in Singapore.
In Singapore, well, the same thing. There is crime everywhere, but it's contained, and it's different. I mean, in Japan, you can put if you're a little shopkeeper, you can put your products out on the street. Nobody will steal them. If you're a woman, you can walk anywhere safely at night, in the middle of the night. But that doesn't mean there's no crime. There is a Yakuza in Japan. There is a deal between the Yakuza and the police as to what kind of crime is permitted and what kind is not, and so on.
What do you think it's the new international agenda after the Cold War?
I think that we should put the Cold War out of our heads. Politicians all over the world, looking at the confusion and complexity of the world scene, disappointed that it didn't turn out to be peaceful after the collapse of the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, tend to blame all our problems on the end of the Cold War. I don't believe that that's true. I believe that we have to have more historical perspective, and that the major event taking place in our time is not the collapse of the Soviet Union or the end of the Cold War. If we look back from 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, we look back at this period of human history, the historians will probably say, well, there was this thing called a Cold War. It lasted a while, and it was very dangerous because they all had nuclear weapons pointed at each other, but it really didn't change very much. On the contrary, what is changing, which is far more important, is the rise of a new kind of civilization on the planet, which we call La Tercera Ola, but you can call it whatever you want. It is an economy that uses knowledge instead of muscle power. It is a technology that enhances intellect, ideas, and knowledge, not just energy and muscles. And then I said earlier that we're now customizing production, that you can, with the information-intensive technologies, you don't produce 1 million identical products. You produce 18 of this, 3 of that, 160 of the other, 2,000 of this, 1 of these, and you can continually change the output. That's why if you go into an American Walmart, there are 110,000 different products. That may be good or bad or crazy, but the fact is you can do it, and you can do it cheaply with the new technologies. And that is what we call the demassification of mass production. But if you then look at what's happening to communication in the high-tech societies, in the United States, we used to have ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it, 3 television networks. That meant that everybody in America saw, or 1/3 of America, in effect, saw the same imagery at night as the other. And now what do you have? We're talking about 500-channel cable television, or an infinite number of communication channels, highly personalized. You're going to have one channel just for you, and I'm going to have one channel just for me, just what I want. And so what is happening is the demassification of the media. If you look at how products get into the society, the distribution system, we go from mass distribution. The next stage is what marketing people call segmented marketing. We make this product and market it just to this group, and another product for another group, and we customize or tailor-make the products for special groups. And now, this is wild, the advanced marketing geniuses in the economy no longer even talk about market segments. They now talk about particle marketing. And what do they mean by a particle? One family. It's you create the product for one family, and you target that family just like precision targeting on the battlefield. The model for the industrial societies was husband goes to work, mama stays home, 2 children under the age of 18. That was the dominant family structure in the United States until the third wave came and brought all these changes. Now fewer than 5% of Americans live in households like that. And you have a variety of family structures, 2 career couples, childless couples, you even have gay couples, you have elderly couples, you have all kinds of family arrangements. So we go from a homogeneous family structure to a heterogeneous family structure, from uniformity to diversity in production, in distribution, in communications, in family structure, and even in warfare.
Alvin Toffler, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
En Londres, Silvia Lemus.